When you think of Henry VIII, the images that spring to mind are almost always the same. The towering king with the infamous appetite, the man who married 6 wives in pursuit of power, and a son, the monarch who tore England from the Catholic Church with one act of defiance that reshaped history forever. You may think of his daughters too, Mary, remembered with dread as Bloody Mary, or Elizabeth, revered as the Virgin Queen, one of the most powerful rulers England ever produced. But hidden in their shadow, there was another figure, a boy, a son Henry had longed for and finally received, a boy who sat upon the throne not as a symbol of peace, but as the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. This child, Edward VI, was the long awaited heir, the son who was supposed to secure the Tudor dynasty and protect England from collapse. For generations, his story has been softened, told as a tale of a frail, tragic boy king who died too soon. But when you peel back the layers of myth, the truth is far more chilling. Edward's short reign was not the innocent interlude many imagine. It was the dawn of authoritarian cruelty, sharpened by fanaticism, and what happened to him, in both life and death, would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. The story begins in 1537. Henry VIII had torn through marriages, executed queens, defied the Pope, and split his kingdom in half, all for the chance to hold a legitimate son. At last, his third wife, Jane Seymour, delivered the miracle he craved. The bells of London rang in celebration, bonfires burned in the streets, and relief swept across the court. For the first time, Henry held not just a child, but his salvation. But this joy came at a terrible cost. Jane Seymour died just 12 days later, leaving Henry's precious heir motherless from birth. That absence would define Edward's entire childhood. Where other children clung to their mothers, Edward had only nurses, courtiers, and tutors. Where other children stumbled through innocence, he was molded like clay into a vessel of divine purpose. His mother's death made him untouchable, sacred, and it ensured he was raised not with love, but with fear. Henry, who had grown increasingly paranoid and desperate with age, understood that this boy represented everything he had fought for. He could not allow Edward to be ordinary. From his earliest days, the young prince was guarded not just by soldiers, but by ideology. He was told, again and again, that he was chosen, destined, and sacred. Every smile, every nod of approval, every gift he received reinforced a single idea. Edward was not merely a boy, he was England itself. Unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had suffered their father's wrath, Edward lived in a cocoon of adoration. Henry showered him with affection, perhaps out of guilt for the torment he had inflicted on his daughters, or perhaps out of terror that he might lose this one fragile heir. But this affection was not balanced by discipline, nor tempered with humility. It was worship. Edward grew up believing that his life was beyond question, that his words carried divine weight, and that he was destined not just to rule, but to rule absolutely. The king chose tutors for his son with deliberate care. He did not want a neutral education. He wanted a weapon forged in theology and intellect. Edward's teachers were not simply scholars, but men consumed by the fire of Protestant Reformation. His primary tutor, John Check, was a brilliant humanist, but he was also a zealot. Lessons in history became lessons in God's will. Philosophy was twisted into justifications for obedience. Even mathematics was laced with metaphors about divine order. Edward learned Latin, Greek, and Scripture with astonishing speed. But he also absorbed something far more dangerous: the belief that Catholics were enemies of God, deserving not tolerance, but elimination. By the age of 6, Edward was debating points of theology that most adults struggle to understand. By 8, he could recite complex arguments for why those who defied Protestant doctrine deserved death. Court observers noted his sharp mind and praised his precocity, but none seemed to ask what it meant for a child to speak so easily of execution and divine punishment. Edward was not taught to play, to laugh, or to form friendships. He was taught to rule, to judge, and to condemn. Imagine the effect: a boy who could speak with professors as an equal, but who had never run through fields with other children. A boy who could argue for God's wrath in flawless Latin, but who did not understand compassion or mercy. Edward was being shaped into something more than a king. He was being shaped into a fanatic. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Edward was only 9 years old. Most children that age are still fragile, still innocent, still struggling to understand the world. But Edward was lifted onto the throne with the weight of an empire behind him. At his coronation, as the crown was lowered onto his head, witnesses described his solemn composure, his almost unnatural seriousness. It was as though the boy already believed the role was his by divine command. In the early months of his reign, his council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, tried to moderate the kingdom. England was still fractured between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and reformers. A child on the throne could have been a time of careful balance, of steady governance. But Edward would not be content with moderation. From the very first council meetings, the boy astonished his elders with his interruptions. He did not sit silently while grown men debated. Instead, he lectured them, his voice still high, still childish, yet filled with the conviction of someone who believed God himself spoke through him. He corrected seasoned nobles on points of doctrine. He dismissed hesitation as cowardice. He demanded action, and action came. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward personally reviewed executions, not as a duty, not with reluctance, but with eagerness. He wanted to read the charges, to weigh the theology, to justify the punishment. Observers whispered about his strange satisfaction. One courtier noted that Edward smiled when signing a death warrant, seemingly pleased at his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for the sentence. This was not the innocence of a child overwhelmed by power. This was something far more unsettling. A boy who had been taught all his life that judgment was his birthright, now tasting its reality for the first time. Edward's temper was equally alarming. When advisers suggested moderation, he erupted into what courtiers called religious tantrums. These were not the cries of a frustrated child, but the rages of a boy convinced that compromise was betrayal. In one infamous incident, when told that some Catholic nobles might be allowed to worship privately, Edward hurled his inkwell across the room and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. Even in his private moments, Edward's interests revealed his dark inclinations. While other boys played with wooden swords or toys, Edward spent his leisure hours reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition. He took detailed notes on interrogation methods, analyzing how confessions were extracted. Servants reported discovering drawings in his chambers, sketches of punishments accompanied by his own annotations on their effectiveness. He was 9 years old. These unsettling glimpses were only the beginning. In his journals, Edward recorded executions and punishments with the same detached tone he used to describe the weather. He wrote of people's suffering not as tragedies, but as curiosities. When a servant was flogged for suspected Catholic prayers and later died, Edward S. only remark was chillingly clinical. Her correction had been more effective than expected. As his reign continued, Edward's sense of power grew bolder. He did not merely approve policies, he began to shape them. By the age of 10, he was composing sermons that were read in churches across England, sermons calling for the elimination of Catholic practices. He envisioned himself not just as king, but as God's chosen purifier, cleansing England of corruption. And so, the boy king who was supposed to be England's salvation began to reveal himself as something else entirely, something colder, more ruthless, more fanatical, a child molded into a tyrant before he had even reached adolescence. The courtiers whispered, the servants trembled, and his own family felt his chilling gaze. His sisters Mary and Elizabeth would soon discover that the brother they once knew was gone, for Edward no longer saw them as family, but as pieces in his divine chess game, one to be destroyed, the other to be used. The kingdom had placed its hope in him. Instead, England had crowned a child who believed mercy was weakness, compassion was betrayal, and death was the path to purity. And Edward was only just beginning to wield his power. Edward VI was no ordinary child. He had never been given the freedom to laugh, to stumble through childhood mistakes, or to feel the warmth of ordinary love. He had been raised in a gilded cage of doctrine and expectation, told from the very beginning that he was chosen by God, destined to cleanse his kingdom. And now, as the crown settled on his head, he began to wield that power in ways that revealed just how deeply he had been poisoned by fanaticism. His cruelty, at first directed outward toward strangers and nameless heretics, soon crept closer to home. Court whispers described how he treated servants with disdain, inventing humiliations not as corrections, but as spectacles of power. A boy who spilled wine upon his papers was dragged into the courtyard and forced to endure hours of rotten food hurled at him. Edward himself, watching intently, scribbling down observations about the boy's shame as though it were a lesson. For Edward, the human soul was not sacred. It was a test subject, a vessel to be judged and broken. Even his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were not spared from his gaze. To Edward, they were not family, they were obstacles and tools. Elizabeth, with her Protestant leanings, was tolerated, useful, perhaps, as a future pawn to strengthen alliances. But Mary was another matter entirely. She was Catholic to her core, stubborn, devout, and unwavering. To Edward, she was not a sister, but an enemy. He began to speak of her in chilling terms, calling her Christ's enemy, describing her legitimacy as a lie, and writing detailed plans for how she might be arrested, tried, and executed. His writings reveal a boy who did not simply want to disinherit Mary. He wanted her erased. He drafted confessions he imagined she might give, forced speeches in which she admitted to her illegitimacy and betrayal of England before receiving a mercifully swift death. He fantasized about her humiliation, her removal, and her end. Court observers noticed how his mood darkened whenever Mary's name was spoken, how he retreated into private rooms to pen long diatribes against her existence. This was not politics. This was obsession, but even while he plotted against his sister, Edward was tightening his grip on the kingdom itself. He was no longer content to allow his council to steer the ship of state. He began to overrule them directly, issuing commands that reflected his uncompromising vision of a purified realm. By the age of 12, he had designed systems of surveillance that turned neighbors into spies, children into informants, and entire villages into webs of suspicion. People were rewarded for reporting even the smallest trace of Catholic sympathy. Families broke apart under the pressure, trust corroded, and the kingdom sank deeper into paranoia. Edward read these reports with fascination. He summoned informants to court to hear their stories firsthand, his boyish curiosity mingling with the cold detachment of a ruler who believed this was God's will. Punishments followed, sometimes imprisonment, sometimes public shaming, and often death. And Edward, chillingly, reviewed each case himself, increasing sentences when he felt they lacked sufficient zeal. He became not just a figurehead for Protestant reform, but its eager executioner. The boy king even invented punishments that carried both cruelty and spectacle. One priest, who refused to renounce his faith, was paraded through London carrying a sign that read, "Enemy of Christ," while children threw stones at him. Edward reportedly watched from his window, laughing as the man stumbled under the weight of jeers and blows. These were not the games of childhood. They were rehearsals of tyranny. For all his intelligence, Edward's understanding of humanity seemed stunted, incomplete. His journals describe the agony of others with the same detached precision he used for weather reports. When people screamed, he noted the pitch. When they wept, he remarked on the persistence. To him, suffering was not tragedy, it was evidence, proof of disobedience, proof of God's justice, proof that his vision was correct. And yet, Edward was still only a child. His thin frame, his pale skin, and his chronic illnesses made him look more fragile than fearsome. But perhaps it was precisely this frailty that sharpened his fanaticism. He knew he might not live long, and so he lived not for joy, but for control, for the illusion of purity that would outlast him. By the time he reached 14, Edward's zeal had intensified into mania. He pressed harder against his council, demanding stricter laws, harsher punishments, more thorough surveillance. He dreamed of a kingdom purged of Catholicism, a land in which every soul was bent toward his vision of God. He drafted plans for religious police who would monitor homes, prayers, even thoughts. His reforms became suffocating, his appetite for control insatiable. But fate had other plans. In early 1553, Edward fell ill. At first, it was thought to be a minor sickness, but it quickly became clear this was no fleeting fever. His body weakened, his cough deepened, and blood stained his lips. Physicians debated endlessly, prescribing treatments that may have worsened his condition. Some whispered it was consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Others suspected poisoning, perhaps by accident, perhaps by misguided medicine. Whatever the cause, the boy who had seemed untouchable was crumbling before their eyes. For many, illness softens the heart. The shadow of death often inspires reflection, regret, or mercy. But not Edward. As his body weakened, his fervor grew stronger. He raged at the thought of Mary inheriting his throne and undoing his Protestant kingdom. He demanded guarantees that his reforms would survive, even if he did not. His words grew more desperate, his visions more extreme. He began meeting with the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, plotting a succession that bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth. His chosen heir would be his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant girl of 16 who could carry his reforms forward. But Edward's plan went further than the history books often tell. His writings reveal fantasies of mass purges, executions of Catholic nobles, confiscation of estates, and the establishment of a permanent, unyielding religious regime. Even in the grip of illness, he filled page after page with shaky handwriting, lists of names marked for elimination, laws to be enforced after his death. Imagine him there in his chamber, thin, pale, coughing blood, yet hunched over parchment with feverish determination, his body failing, but his pen relentless. His courtiers described his delirium as visions, sermons delivered to empty air, fiery speeches shouted in the night. But his journals show these were not mere ravings. They were intentions. Edward's final weeks were agony. Physicians applied desperate remedies, some laced with arsenic, which may have hastened his decline. His flesh wasted, his breath came in ragged gasps, and yet still he raged about Catholic enemies. Still he plotted. Still he clung to the dream of a kingdom ruled not by compassion, but by purity. And then, on July 6th, 1553, the boy king died. He was 15 years old. England mourned the death of a child, but few understood what had truly been lost, or perhaps what had been narrowly escaped. Within days, his plan unraveled. Mary seized the throne. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign collapsed, and the kingdom lurched violently back toward Catholicism. Yet Edward's shadow lingered, for in him, England had seen the terrifying possibility of tyranny not from a hardened warlord, but from a boy raised in isolation, indoctrinated into fanaticism, and given the tools of absolute power. Edward VI has long been remembered as frail, tragic, and unremarkable compared to his father and sisters. But his story, when told in full, is something else entirely. It is a warning, a reminder that cruelty does not always arrive in the form of a battle-scarred tyrant. Sometimes it comes in the soft voice of a child who never learned mercy, who never knew love, who never understood humanity. Edward's reign lasted just 6 years, but in that brief time, he revealed how fragile the line is between innocence and tyranny, between faith and fanaticism. His death was slow, agonizing, and some whispered it was justice, that the boy who gave no mercy found none in the end. Whether divine retribution or cruel chance, it was a fittingly haunting end for a king who had planned to leave England drowning in fire. If this story has gripped you, if the shadow of Edward VI's reign has made you reconsider what power does to the human soul, I invite you to subscribe. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history, uncovering the hidden truths and forgotten horrors that remind us just how thin the veil of civilization can be. By subscribing, you'll never miss the next descent into history's most unsettling tales. But now, I want to hear from you. Was Edward VI a victim, an innocent child, warped by fanatical tutors and the crushing expectations of his father? Or was there something darker in him, something that even upbringing cannot fully explain? Was England robbed of a king, or spared from a tyrant who never had the chance to grow into adulthood? Share your thoughts in the comments, for it is in wrestling with these questions that we keep history alive, not as dry facts, but as haunting truths that still echo in us today.